This is the Washington Times front page for Thursday, June 16th, 2022. Thanks for joining us. I'm George Gerbo. President Biden has reignited his attacks on energy companies, demanding that they boost refined oil output. But industry leaders say his rhetoric only exacerbates America's refining capacity problems that have inflated gas prices. In a letter to 7 of the largest U.S. oil companies, Ramsey Touchberry reports the president blames corporate greed and Russia's war in Ukraine for the spike in fuel costs. The president also threatened to invoke his emergency powers to force more refined output to meet demand. Energy producers and analysts reject Biden's assertion that the reason for high gas prices is that refineries are simply sitting on untapped potential. Amanda Eversole, Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Petroleum Institute, said industry investments are made over the course of decades, not news cycles. U.S. refining capacity is already near full use. The Energy Information Administration expects capacity to reach 96% this month. Those record-high gas prices, coupled with rapidly rising costs for food and other goods, are hitting individuals and families at the lower end of the income scale hard. Susan Ferricchio reports some Americans are virtually stranded at home, unable to travel anywhere because they can't afford to fill up their cars. The price crunch is also sending more people to food banks and other charities. Consumer prices rose 8.6% in May over last year's figures. That was higher than economists expected and up from 8.3% in April. In response, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates by 0.75 of a percentage point in an effort to tame inflation. It's the biggest hike since 1994, and Fed Chairman Jay Powell says more hikes are on the way the rest of the year. Cracks are deepening across Europe over how to handle the Russia-Ukraine endgame, as a growing number of Europeans favor immediate peace over the continuation of a hardline anti-Russia stance. Even as NATO officials gathered in Brussels to map out the next round of assistance to the Ukrainian military, Ben Wolfgang reports it's become increasingly clear that the European public is growing weary of war and wants its leaders to push for peace. Former NATO Secretary General Jaap de Hoop Schäfer said Europe has hit a fork in the road with respect to the war. He acknowledged that rifts have emerged as the fighting drags on, casualties mount, and food and fuel prices skyrocket around the world. Other former NATO officials warned some European leaders, presumably those in Hungary and Italy who've been the most vocal proponents of an immediate ceasefire, against pushing Ukraine into a bad peace. You can read all of these stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page. You can also find this and all of our Washington Times podcasts at WashingtonTimes.com/podcasts. Republican Myra Flores' win in a special election in Texas flipped a heavily Hispanic House district controlled for decades by Democrats and could portend further gains for Republicans in November. Susan Ferricchio reports Flores, a former Hispanic outreach chair for the Hidalgo County Republican Party, defeated Democrat Dan Sanchez in Texas's 34th congressional district at the southern tip of the state on the border with Mexico. Flores will have a tougher challenge in the general election when she'll face current Congressman Vicente Gonzalez and try to win a full term. Gonzalez is switching from his 15th district seat to the 34th due to redistricting. The seat formerly belonged to Democrat Filemon Vela, who resigned from Congress to take a job as a lobbyist. The new president of America's largest Protestant denomination vows reforms to prevent sexual abuse and assault in Southern Baptist churches. Mark Kellner reports Bart Barber is promising changes and that church administrative practices must be turned against those who would injure church members. He said his first task will be to find and appoint members of an abuse reform task force charged with implementing the recommendations approved by delegates at the Southern Baptist Convention's annual business meeting on Tuesday. A report released May 22nd by Guidepost Solutions detailed hundreds of instances of sexual abuse by Southern Baptist Church pastors, lay members, and those at institutions such as colleges, universities, and seminaries. And finally, the George Washington University has announced it will stop using its Colonials nickname by the 2023-2024 academic year. Jacob Meyer reports the decision was made by the university's Board of Trustees. Critics argued the name glorified racism, slavery, and colonialism. The move comes after a special committee that was formed in 2020 to consider a name change concluded the Colonials moniker does not adequately match the values of GW and can no longer serve its purpose as a name that unifies the community. Find all today's front page stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page or on the Washington Times app, and find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Washington Times in your favorite podcast app. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wash Times for breaking news, sports, commentary, and more. For the Washington Times, I'm George Gerbo.